Good evening and welcome to Merit Watch tonight. My name is David Craig. A couple things we want to get to this evening to highlight the last 2 weeks of Prime Minister Mark Carney's tenure, as Prime Minister here in Canada with his Liberal minority government. A couple of things we're going to go over as recent announcements we have found out about his new cabinet and cabinet appointees. Although, is it new or is it some of the same old? We're going to be going through that, as well as some other things regarding budget, or is Mark Carney just focusing on optics? What's happening with President Donald Trump and his trips around the world, and has there been any progress with Canada and trade talks? As we know, that has been and was a giant issue during the election. But before we get into that, I just want to let you know in just a couple minutes, we're going to be joined by Eric Kaufmann, who's a professor of politics at University of Buckingham in London, and he'll have some great insights as to what's going on here behind the scenes in Canada. But first and foremost, some news that came out today is that Mark Carney has delayed introducing a full federal budget. It's actually not expected that there will be a budget this year in the calendar year of 2025, choosing instead to roll out a fall economic statement, which in a couple months, I believe in September. And this is interesting to me for a leader who is claiming to be an economist, as he says that he's an economist and knows better, someone who is steeped in this financial tradition and responsibility. To delay a federal budget is a big deal. It is something that we as citizens, we need to have fiscal transparency. We need to have fiscal readiness and understand where are dollars going to be deployed? Where is there additional or new revenues, or is there lack of revenues? Where are we going to be spending and putting our money towards? Because this is something we were promised as voters change, as Prime Minister Mark Carney specifically said. How is he different from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? Well, he's going to have a focus on the economy and an intense focus moving forward. This feels like a little bit of a stall. It's not about budget or being fiscally responsible or transparent. It feels like it's optics, in my opinion. That's something that we need to be aware of, because a budget is something we need to have to know, especially in the economic situation that Canada has been in, the declining economic situation we have been in for the last 10 years. And is there any hope or chance of that changing in the near future or the medium term? It doesn't look like, but how could we know without a proper budget to keep account? The one thing they did mention is that they will be doing, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne did announce the modest 1% cut to the lowest income tax bracket, down from 15 to 14%. Is really, to be honest, seems a bit of a gesture or a symbolic gesture than an actual meaningful tax relief, as 1% does not make a giant difference for families in the lowest tax bracket, especially for middle-class families who are already struggling under high inflation as well as interest rates that have been up. The broader fiscal strategy still remains to be vague. So that's something to be watching for as well. A quick highlight, we found out yesterday that Prime Minister Mark Carney had announced his cabinet, and they were sworn in. And some people are praising him for a cabinet shrink. I know the number was dropped from 39, which was previous Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's cabinet size, to 28 people, which was presented as a streamlined government. But I believe some critics, and I might even criticize this as well, it might be called consolidation of power to people who have been maybe more loyal. The reason why I'm stating that is because I was looking at each individual appointment, and I do think appointments need to be based on merit, on capability. Can someone do the job? Can someone be the best person for the job based on knowledge, skill, vision, leadership ability, especially in areas of transportation, of finance, especially in areas of like technology and the new Minister of AI. These are important positions that have got tremendous opportunity. But it seems like there's a recycled appointments that have come through from the Trudeau era policies and Trudeau era cabinet. There's no reform that Mark Carney ran on. It doesn't seem like there's reform. It seems like it's more of the same. Yes, there are some new ministers that have been appointed as they have won seats or they have joined the Liberal Party, but it's very interesting to look at. For example, a key thing that we should look at is the new Minister of AI, I believe, or Minister of AI, who was a former journalist. Not, if you look in the United States, who is someone who represents the technology sector and AI as it emerges as someone in Trump's wings, you look at the man David Sachs, who was appointed there, who is an original tech investor. His hands are through and through technology. He knows what he's talking about when it comes to it. He's on the forefront of the breaking technology, where we don't seem to have that. So again, it comes down to the question, is this more about identity politics, or is it more about merit in these appointments? Because we need to get back to a merit-based society based on, guess what you do, what you've earned, how you deserve it, based on your skills, abilities, the ability to create and move things forward, versus just who you are, or if you have friends, or identity politics. That's something I wanted to highlight. There still seems to be no plan for affordability, as there is no detailed policy on Canada's housing crisis, food inflation, or even energy affordability. There's even been conflicts between, for example, Stephen Gobert, who's still in the cabinet. He made comments yesterday stating no new pipelines will be built, where Mark Carney verbally is taking a bit more of a pragmatic approach by stating we want to become an energy superpower. It's on the table, as he was sitting down with CTV yesterday. But that seems to be a discrepancy, and it's going to be interesting to see how does that play out. Not just interesting, I'm hoping that Mark Carney is actually going to move forward with action. I don't want to hear words, I want to hear action about how we can build Canada's economy. And a big part of that is our energy sector, our energy resources, and interprovincial trade, and like Premier Danielle Smith said, access to tidewater ports in Canada. Those are ways he can solve some problems very quick. Anyways, there's a number of things that have happened in the last 24 hours. There are some of them. Right after this break, we'll be joined by Eric Kaufmann, who's professor of politics over at University of Buckingham. We'll be right back. Well, welcome back to Merit Watch tonight. I am happy to be joined by Eric Kaufmann, who's been with us before, professor of politics at University of Buckingham over in London, England. Eric, welcome back to the show. How are you?
David, it's great to be back.
Yeah, well, last time we had a great conversation. Really appreciated your insights. We're now about 2 weeks past approximately our last conversation. Canada has moved forward a little bit in terms of our new Liberal minority government, which I'm not sure if you're following, has seemed to have been growing seat by seat with some recounts as
Right.
they keep happening. But I know you wrote a piece very recently, just kind of some insights and thoughts on Mark Carney and where they're going. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Explain to us what you're thinking, what your response is to Mark Carney, his government, over the last 2 weeks.
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is there's obviously a lot of continuity with the Trudeau government in terms of the cabinet appointments, and what's important, I think, to focus on is that if you look underneath, I did a piece that really looked at the election results,
Hmm.
and there are issues that didn't figure in the election, immigration, culture wars, issues like how Canadian history is taught,
Hmm.
the Indigenous question. That didn't figure in the election in the debates, for example. Perhaps that was deliberate on the part of the CBC and the media. But actually, when you look at who votes for which party, in fact, these issues were quite important. And there is kind of an emerging left right split or left right block in which um, the old pattern where voters, who would vote conservative one election and liberal the next election and back, that seems to be withering away. And in fact, what we have are two sort of pawns. There's the right pawn where you'll vote conservative. You might go to the PPC. Then the left pawn where you are an NDP voter, but you might lend your vote to the Liberals. And so your only choice is NDP or Liberal, or in the right block, it's conservative PPC, but you're not going to consider, going across that line. I think
That's
that
right.
is where politics is going in Canada. And I always, what I would say take away from that election is really the Conservatives getting their best popular vote result for 40 years. And so anybody who thinks that the Trump effect was to make conservative voters go liberal, I think that's a misreading of the results. That actually it's quite a strong result for the conservatives, and something that is maybe a hint of where Canadian politics is going, which is kind of in that more polarized direction we see perhaps in the United States. The only question is going to be how many, what's the vote share going to be between NDP and Liberal? And that'll depend on whether NDP voters think that the Liberals are selling them out and not being left wing enough, and then they might go back to the NDP. But that is really the main question. And so I think this pattern, and we're seeing this in Britain as well, where I'm located, very much whether you voted Brexit or Remain in the referendum. If you voted to leave the EU, your choice is between Nigel Farage and Reform or
Hmm.
between the Conservative Party. And you're not really going to go over necessarily to one of the left-wing parties and vice versa. And so I think there's common elements in both countries, even though it may not look it. And so actually this polarization is becoming more important in Canada.
Well, it's interesting to see, even though we're not a two-party system, it's kind of moving that direction in terms of where the vote is. And you made a mention the highest vote turnout for Conservatives, and it still was not enough for them. And obviously, the NDP had a bit of a part to play with their collapse. And you even just referenced President Donald Trump in his comments about preferring to work with a liberal government or a liberal over the other guys. So you were just can you expand on that a little bit? You don't think that made enough of a difference in the sense of Conservatives crossing the aisle at all?
No, I don't. I really don't think that's the story of this election. I think the story of this election is the threat or perceived threat from Trump uh, making very left wing, like NDP and Green voters, suddenly think, ooh, we have to actually think more pragmatically here.
Hmm.
And therefore, we're going to actually move to the Liberal Party. So
Yeah.
it's moved the left into the center left.
Yeah.
And that's really the dynamic. It didn't really move people from the right to the left. And so I think the storyline that says this is a verdict that, that Trump really made a lot of conservatives scared and run to the Liberals. That's not what happened. What it
Yeah.
did was it made a lot of NDP voters a bit scared, and therefore, hey, we can't just express our political beliefs. We actually need to be more responsible, and so we're going to go
Hmm.
for more responsible guy like Carney. And clearly, what that means, of course, is in the future, if for whatever reason it looks like Carney is not making much difference on the Trump file, or if the Trump issue fades away, then you would expect maybe the NDP voter to think, okay, what's he doing for my kind of left wing causes?
Yeah.
And if he's not doing enough, maybe we're going to go back to the NDP, which would really collapse the Liberal vote and make it much more easy. Because really, this is a story about the Liberals cannibalizing the left wing vote. It's not about right wingers going to the left.
Yeah.
That's important. In Britain, we have the reverse situation where, the populist voters on the right went over to the Tories, swelling the Tory vote, allowing them to have a majority government. Now they've defected en masse to the populists again under Farage, collapsing the Tory vote and almost possibly wiping out the Tory. And so that's the new dynamic we're in, but it's really based on a kind of tribal, increasingly visceral dislike of the other side. So liberal voters really really don't like Pierre Poilievre, and conservative voters really don't like Mark Carney, like
Yeah.
to the tune of 85, 90%.
Yeah.
This is something that's been developing in the US for decades, and it's now happening in Canada as well. So I think this is the way our politics is going to look more and more.
Well, you can that definitely rings true when you look at how and also what media outlets or personalities you're talking about in terms of their response to Mark Carney, specifically in how he's handled Trump in their first visit and post meeting. You have people that might typically be on the left side of the aisle that is praising and saying it was absolutely brilliant, what a way to. But then people on the right side of the aisle are talking about how much of a disaster it is. And it seems to be losing that center nucleus of reason, or at least some sort of familiarity that, okay, we both saw the same event. Because if you were to read
Right,
different
right.
opinions, it's like, were you guys watching the same thing? It's amazing how much of a filter that can put on the populist's eyes. And obviously something we all have to be aware of. What do you think contributes to that separation, or you could even use the word tribalism in the sense of this is my camp, that's your camp. We've been losing, I feel, that ability to come to the table and have the reasonable discussions, even if we agree to disagree. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as the issues change from sort of policy questions or even economic questions where it's all about competence and uh, managerial competence, and it becomes more a question of culture and values, where you are on immigration, where you are on things like indigenous and trans and a lot of these issues, or environment to some degree, these are emotional issues. And to the extent that these are about sacred values or values issues, those are much more zero-sum in nature and much less tradable than questions
Okay.
about, okay, tax rate a little higher, a little lower, a little more
Yeah.
spending here or
Good point.
there. And to the extent we're moving into a more cultural style of politics, then what's called effective partisanship.
Sure.
Attachment to your party is an emotional thing now, and you dislike the other party.
Yes.
And this trend is happening more and more. And this is why I'm saying that I think Canadian politics is, well, in fact, political scientists have shown that that's where Canadian politics has been moving in the last decade or so. And so I think we should just expect to see less of a swing between conservative and liberal. And the big question as to who wins the election will really be, are the NDP voters going to express themselves as NDP, or are they going to subsume their vote into the Liberals? And that will be possibly the story of elections going forward.
Well, I think that's the question that is being raised now in Western Canada, because you've seen record high turnout for Conservatives, and I think there's a lot of people in Alberta who might have separatist sentiment or independent sentiment here in the
Mm.
West, saying that we're still putting our best foot forward and we're still not being represented. We're still not winning, so to speak, or have a chance to win, because the NDP isn't going to be crossing the aisle. They're going to continue to vote Liberal in that sense. And obviously, you just brought some clarity with the issues, which bring a heightened emotionalism to it as well,
Mm.
which again brought some clarity to me. Thoughts on that in terms of the representation across Canada, and why some provinces might feel alienated from that sense.
Yeah, I think that provinces that are see themselves as consistently out of power, not represented in the center, can have this alienation. Scotland and Britain, Scottish separatism tends to be higher when the Conservatives are in power, especially over multiple administrations. It's the same phenomenon. Do I think I don't think that separatist sentiment is high enough necessarily in Alberta or
Yeah.
Saskatchewan to lead to a secessionist movement. However, I do think it's enough to lead to alienation and fracturing of a sense of unity, which has all kinds of other problems because provinces are always negotiating with the federal center. Now, again, with the turn of the political, what is this going to mean
Yeah.
going forward? Maybe that Western alienation means the Conservatives do even better
Mm.
in the West. Um, I would say if we see election after election and the Conservatives out of power, I think yes, I think that alienation could become a stronger force. However, I'm still skeptical. If Carney really does take the Liberals into the center, I think he's going to alienate quite a lot of those left-wing voters. And so one of the questions is whether those left-wing voters really have moved now in a permanent way, as we see in the US, for example, where Jill Stein and those sorts of people get very small amounts of the vote.
Yeah.
If the Liberals really become the left-wing party and the left is bigger than the right in Canada,
Yeah.
then you have a recipe for alienation, of losing every election. And if in Northern Ireland, the parties that lost every election eventually turned to civil war. It's not going to happen in Canada, but it's going to increase alienation.
And a fair point to be made as well is that develops over time. It's going to take time to actually see that it's not an immediate thing like there seems to be. And obviously, I don't want to dismiss, there is a growing sentiment in Alberta, because I'm in Alberta. I do see it and sense it. There's individual groups garnering lots of signatures when it comes to this idea of pursuing a referendum. The question becomes, as it goes through over the course of time in 2026, as Premier Smith has said, is there going to be enough to cross that 50% threshold where things start to get serious? We don't know, but some of your points are very fair. I want to we only got about a minute left here.
Mm.
I want to get your thoughts just quickly on I'm going to lay a little bit of a scenario here. We had President Donald Trump and Mark Carney meet last week. President Trump is making his rounds around the world after the scare of Liberation Day when it comes to
Right.
all the tariff talk and throwing tariffs, like you get a tariff, almost Oprah Winfrey style. And now he's been making deals. China, it's not a deal, but they got a 90-day trade, I guess, intermedium that they're going to be reducing 10% and vice versa, give or take. He's in Saudi Arabia, and he's been in Qatar and making deals and getting investments in. We haven't heard anything regarding Canada, U.S., even though we are tied at the hip. Mark Carney's been stating things about how we originally during the campaign fundamentally reimagine our economy, also our relationship with the U.S. as we know it is over, more independence. What do you think Mark Carney's approach is when it comes to our economy? Because Canada's economy is a giant factor right now. It's probably top of mind for a ton of people. And you have President Donald Trump making his rounds around the world, this nationalist approach trying to make America as strong as possible. What do you think, first off, Mark Carney has been doing, and what should he be doing? I know it's a long question, but feel free to take it.
I mean, well, Britain, of course, just did a trade deal and got a 10%, got it down from
That's right.
25 to 10. I think that the big task really for someone like Carney is to try and at least get that deal.
Okay.
And much depends on what's going on with Trump and his inner circle. There's a battle, of course, as you know, between, and I think the other bit of context is because Trump's approval rating has been going down. It was in the low 50s and is now in the mid 40s. And to the extent that his congressmen are worried about the midterms and their constituents, particularly in areas affected by the tariffs on Canada, are going to be putting pressure. I mean, I guess the hope is there's enough pressure there. He seems to be backpedaling from certainly this idea of reshoring and using tariffs to raise revenue. And if the thinking really has changed and the Navarros and the various protectionists are losing ground, then that would open Trump up. Because I think this is ultimately down to Trump. I don't think Carney is going to make any difference, really. It's going to be if Trump has a change of heart. So I think it's all down to Trump's mysterious mind, unfortunately.
I think that's the way to state it, because there's two distinct camps. People either in the camp of Trump is playing 4D chess and he is 10 steps ahead of everybody, or he's just throwing stuff against the wall and reacting in real time to how things unfold. So, and it wasn't interesting. I'm not sure if you saw this, but President Donald Trump made a comment, I believe it's 2 days ago now. There's going to be an announcement coming out that is earth-shattering, as he said, between Canada and the U.S. Has nothing to do with trade. We don't know what that is. It's one of those things that Trump teases. Anyways, don't mean to tease you with some more as you guys continue watching Merit Watch tonight, but we do got to cut it off now. But Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Always appreciate your time.
David, it's been a pleasure as always.
We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Merit Watch tonight. Hope you enjoyed that segment with Eric Kaufmann. He had some interesting thoughts to say. In our close here, I want to bring our attention to Canada's energy sector, our natural resources that we have, which is being underutilized and can have a tremendous impact on the economy in bringing dollars in. And guess what? Bringing investment in if our government can get out of the way. We've actually had a net negative investment in Canada over the last 10 years because of the bureaucracy, the red tape, meaning we've had no new investors wanting to invest and risk their money to build infrastructure pipelines, especially when you look at midstreamers. They're not willing to put their money up to build because of how our government has been getting in the way. This is something that needs to be seriously looked at, because you have Mark Carney, who's been stating, I think, some decent things and a pragmatic approach about helping Canada becoming an energy superpower, but yet he's got cabinet ministers like Stephen Gobert, who is now the new Minister of Canadian Identity, whatever that means, stating that we do not need to build new ones because TMX pipeline is only at 40% capacity, and we will hit peak oil in the next 2 years, which is misleading. It seems like there's a slightly good cop, bad cop idea. The point is that when we continue to have government interference or government bureaucracy and have this type of leadership in power in cabinet stating this, you're not going to have any new investment, any companies, any streamers wanting to invest and risk their money to build pipelines, to build refineries, to build the things that we need, which can get out to the world and bring not just finance into Canada, not just help our economy, not just help you and I and build citizens, but actually can raise the worldwide standard of how we get our energy. It's something that has to be watched, because this is what's going to continue to be a battle between Alberta and Premier Smith and the citizens of Alberta and what's happening in Ottawa with their approach. Anyways, just some food for thought as we get through this week. Thank you for watching. This is Merit Watch tonight. We'll see you soon.